Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century, written by the loathsome Project for a New American Century in September of 2000. These people are a bunch of warmongers, in part because it's easy to be a warmonger when you've never actually served in the military. It's easy for you to cheer about other people getting involved and getting killed when you don't have to pay that kind of price, and no one in your family has to pay that kind of price, and you don't encourage your family to pay that kind of price. I did a review recently for the Palestine Bookshelf channel in which I read the Israel Project's Global Language Dictionary for 2009, which was put together by Frank Luntz. And I shared in that review that I was so irritated by the dictionary that I couldn't put together an episode plan. I couldn't put together an outline, which is normally how I do these reviews. I put together an outline based on different excerpts, and I categorize and I process that way. I was too upset. The reality is true here about this horrible thing as well, is that I was too upset about what I read in order to put together something coherent. So I'm just going to go through this chronologically. I'm going to try to keep my voice down as I do so. But I would say the first half of this report is really what we're focused on. The second half gets really into technical nitty gritty. Here are the weapon systems that the Air Force should improve. Here are the weapon systems the Navy should improve. Here's how we should change our force posture. I will talk briefly. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about the specificity of weapon systems, especially since this report's it's 25 years old at this point, so a lot of it's obsolete. But some thinking is still quite interesting. I'm really going to focus on the assumptions that are made by the people for the Project for the New American Century, because there's a straight line between the thinking in this horrible report and to people in the Trump administration who are in power now. People like recently fired Mike Waltz, Pete Hegseth, and even to some extent, unfortunately, people like J.D. Vance, who seem to be more and more compromised as the days go on. So I'm going to read a little bit from this, and as I say, I'm going to try to keep my voice down as we walk through this together, so please be patient with me. Established in the spring of 1997, the Project for the New American Century is a nonprofit educational organization whose goal is to promote American global leadership. The project is an initiative of the New Citizenship Project. William Crystal, horrible person, is chairman of the project, and Robert Kagan, Devin Gaffney Cross, Bruce P. Jackson, and, God help me, John R. Bolton serve as directors. Gary Schmidt is executive director of the project. So here are some of the premises that undergird the whole report. So once you understand these statements, these assertions, you understand how the spirit in which this entire report is written, which does not take a single author, but everyone associated with PNAC is willing to accede to the assertions in the document. As the 20th century draws to a close, the United States stands as the world's most preeminent power. Having led the West to victory in the Cold War, America faces an opportunity and a challenge. Does the United States have the vision to build upon the achievement of past decades? Does the United States have the resolve to shape a new century favorable to American principles and interests? Now, on its own, it is not terrible for your country to work towards a state of affairs in which things are favorable for your country. In fact, I would hope that every country would conduct their foreign affairs in such a way that things are favorable for them. But that isn't what they're wanting here. What we require is a military that is strong and ready to meet both present and future challenges, a foreign policy that boldly and purposely promotes American principles abroad, and national leadership that accepts the United States' global responsibilities. Two things implied there. One is that it's not enough for us as Americans to enjoy America. We have to promote it and impress it onto other people. We have to make other parts of the world like America. That's crazy. The second, the United States' global responsibilities. We as U.S. taxpayers now have to contribute our blood and our money to police work all around the world. That is also crazy. I'm saying that's crazy, but you realize there are people in power in Washington who believe these ideas. And that shapes how they react to world events, and that shapes how they talk about things. particularly President Trump, he's stuck in many ways in this America is the greatest of all time and must always be the greatest of all time thinking. Of course, the United States must be prudent in how it exercises its power, but we cannot safely avoid the responsibilities of global leadership of the costs that are associated with its exercise. America has a vital role in maintaining peace and security in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Not true. America does not have a vital role in maintaining peace and security in Europe. The Europeans can do it. Not in Asia. The Asians can do it. And not in the Middle East. The people in the Middle East can do it. If we shirk our responsibilities, we invite challenges to our fundamental interests. Notice that it's not about peace. It's about challenges to our fundamental interests. That's the problem. The history of the 20th century should have taught us that it is important to shape circumstances before crises emerge, and to meet threats before they become dire. The history of the past century should have taught us to embrace the cause of American leadership. And I wrote in the margin, we are the crisis. We are the people who cause problems. One of the very first things I wrote as a student, I would have been a junior in high school at the time, my term paper was about U.S. intervention in World War I, and I said that U.S. intervention in World War I led directly to World War II. It was one of the contributing events because we caused a lopsided end of World War I, which led to horrible terms for the Germans, which led to a situation in which the Germans were very susceptible to not saying that they were the most horrible people ever because the treaty told them that they were, and then their nation arises and things take their course in World War II. But the point that I'm making is that even as a 16, 17-year-old kid, I knew that we had made severe mistakes in foreign policy as a country. And yet the narrative is that we're the defenders of freedom. We're the greatest thing ever. And America needs to continue to be in charge of everything. I remember some years ago, now it must have been pre-COVID, I was sitting in Melbourne for breakfast with an acquaintance, and I was lamenting U.S., what this document refers to as constabulary actions, America being the policeman of the world. And I said, this is horrible. And he says, well, yeah, I would rather have the Americans be in charge than anyone else. And he wasn't able to penetrate what I was saying. I said, I don't want anyone to be in charge of it. I want the Australians to take care of Australian matters. I want Asians to take care of Asian matters. I do not want a force, especially and oftentimes immoral, led by money, as Smedley Butler refers to him as a Medal of Honor winning Marine Corps general. He said he was a gangster for capitalism. I don't want a country that employs gangsters for capitalism being world constabularies. But yet the impression of this young Australian boy, not fair to call him boy, man, that we really want the United States in charge because they're the best equipped, just shows how much he doesn't know about what the US's real mission, real interests are. I'll put a link to Matt Kennard's The Racket in the description as well as a card. There are all sorts of other things at play rather than freedom and democracy, which is always the brand of America. We're out supporting freedom, but that's not the reality. The United States is the world's only superpower, combining preeminent military power, global technological leadership, and the world's largest economy. Well, it was at that time. China caught up. Moreover, America stands at the head of a system of alliances, which includes the world's other leading democratic powers. Now, the term system of alliances doesn't convey the fact that this is all a trap. Alliances are how we got into World War I and World War II, because if you move, then I move. My options are removed from making a decision that makes sense for my country, as opposed to making a decision based on a straight line treaty that I made with you. Interlocking treaties, what he's calling, what's being called here, a system of alliances. These are problems. These are how wars get started, not how wars are avoided. But again, the brand is presented. This is how we've avoided wars, because we've had these things. At present, the United States faces no global rival. America's grand strategy should aim to preserve and extend this advantageous position as far into the future as possible. Now, just reading that makes my head hurt, because it's ahistorical. Anyone who has studied history knows that all empires end. And what if Rome had produced such a document? What if the Persians had produced such a document? What if the Greeks had produced such a document? What if the Egyptians, that instead of saying, look, at some point our empire will end, what is the way for us to make that end not so bad for us and our people? Instead, we're going to be amazing forever, when that isn't possible. So this at the very beginning of the document shows you just how crazy and obsessed with themselves and high on this crazy idea of America these people are. The defense policy guidance drafted in the early months of 1992 provided a blueprint for maintaining U.S. preeminence, precluding the rise of a great power rival, and shaping the international security order in line with American principles and interests. And I wrote in the margin, how can you preclude the rise of a great power rival? Going back to Rome and Persia, Rome only had to take care of itself. The idea that you can also, at the same time while taking care of yourself, prevent someone else from rising. When other people in the world, other countries in the world want their countries to rise as well for various reasons, that you can simply do that by will. And I wrote, how? With what money? With what weapons? And even then, what are you going to occupy these people to make sure that they can't possibly rise as well? It's not possible. It's not possible militarily. It's not possible monetarily without dictatorship and a police state. And in a certain sense, that's what the United States is. The United States is a large police state which imposes its will on the rest of the world. And in unbelievable public relations propaganda style, Edward Bernays, I'll put a link to that in the description as well as a card, they paint themselves as the opposite. They are the defenders of freedom. They're the defenders of peace. Without America, we wouldn't have that. It's the same with the Israelis saying that they're the most moral army in the world when they're the most immoral army in the world. They're the ones who play the victims when they are the actual victimizers. They talk about mass rapes and beheaded babies when they're the ones doing those things. We have documentation of their mass rapes. They have no evidence for their accusations. We have pictures of the beheaded babies. They have no evidence of the beheaded babies. So here, America, like Israel, following that playbook of trying to keep everyone down for their own interests. That doesn't work long term. It doesn't provide a win-win in which you have a more sustainable future for the whole world. It makes sure that you are on top. It plays a zero-sum game in which no one else can rise. And it is an imminent danger, not just to the United States, but to everyone else. Establish 4 core missions for U.S. military forces. Defend the American homeland. I underline that as appropriate. Of course, all countries should seek to defend your homeland. And you should have a military force in order to do that. That's the underlining of the classic pray for peace, but train for war. You do that by making sure you can defend your family, you can defend your town, you can defend your country. That's fine. Keep going. Fight and decisively win multiple, simultaneous, major theater wars. Perform the constabulary duties associated with shaping the security environment in critical regions. Transform U.S. forces to exploit the revolution in military affairs. I put 3 exclamation points next to that. All of these things are crazy. And what's interesting is that as Bush campaigned, George W. Bush, in his first term, to say that he wanted a humble foreign policy and no nation building, and then he became the opposite, arrogant foreign policy and unbelievable nation building. Trump campaigns as the peace candidate and then gets involved in all sorts of wars at the beginning of his second term. The opposite of what is promoted is actually what is happening. They buy into this idea. He wants to increase military spending to some ridiculous number. Why? Because I think they still buy into this fight and decisively win multiple simultaneous major theater wars and perform the constabulary duties associated with shaping the security environment in critical regions. Even if those critical regions are closer to the American homeland, let's say in Central and South America, that still assumes projecting American power outside of America, which is crazy. I don't know how else to say it, but it's crazy for America to try to impose its will on other countries. It doesn't provide for a sustainable peace in the short term, and it doesn't provide for a useful future for everybody, even just on the natural level. We're not talking about the supernatural level, although that's the most important thing. But on the natural level, how are you supposed to foster growth for everybody when you see everything, particularly as Trump, as a zero-sum game? I win, you lose. To carry out these core missions, we need to provide sufficient force and budgetary allocations. In particular, the United States must maintain nuclear strategic superiority, basing the U.S. nuclear deterrent upon a global nuclear net assessment that weighs the full range of current and emerging threats, not merely the U.S.-Russia balance. Restore the personnel strength of today's force to roughly the levels anticipated in the base force outlined by the Bush administration, and increase in active duty strength from 1.4 to 1.6 million. Reposition U.S. forces to respond to 21st century strategic realities by shifting permanently based forces to Southeast Europe and Southeast Asia, and by changing naval deployment patterns to reflect growing U.S. strategic concerns in East Asia. And I wrote, no, 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 in the margin next to all of that. Control the new international commons of space and cyberspace, and pave the way for the creation of a new military service, U.S. Space Forces, with the mission of space control, not exploration. Controlling space, making sure that we are in charge of space and everyone else has to bow to us. Increase defense spending to a minimum level of 3.5 to 3.8% of GDP, adding 15 to 20 billion to total defense spending annually. If you've ever watched Eisenhower's farewell address, if I can find a link to that on YouTube, I'll put that link in the description. He gives you the cost of things. He says, this is how much an aircraft carrier costs, and here's how many schools we could build. Here's how much this plane costs, here's how many hospitals we could build. And when you look at this 15 to 20 billion, under the premises of we have to fight and win simultaneous wars, we have to police the whole world, the price that we have to pay is here. They're listing it. And the question is why? Why would we spend that money on weapons, making the world less safe, when we could spend it on our own people, educating them, taking care of our land, taking care of our people, being a force for good in the world? We can't do that. We have to bully and intimidate everybody and maintain American supremacy. The American peace has proven itself peaceful, stable, and durable. It's simply not true. These are delusions of grandeur. When someone writes something like that and actually believes it, it's not true. The American peace has in some ways been a lie. It has, over the past decade, provided the geopolitical framework for widespread economic growth. The most important thing to us as Americans, money. And the spread of American principles of liberty and democracy. Yes, invading other countries. Those are our principles of liberty and democracy. Yet no moment in international politics can be frozen in time. Even a global Pax Americana will not preserve itself. Paradoxically, as American power and influence are at their apogee, American military forces limp towards exhaustion, are unable to meet the demands of their many and varied missions, including preparing for tomorrow's battlefield. And I wrote, why? Today's force, reduced by a third or more over the past decade, suffers from degraded combat readiness, from difficulties in recruiting and retaining sufficient numbers of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And I said, why? This may not have come up in the channel before, but I served in the U.S. Marine Corps in the Reserve. And I knew even at that time, in the late 90s, early 2000s, that recruiting was a problem, in part because it's not a very attractive lifestyle. So even if certain elements of society will join, over time it just becomes less and less attractive as America gets involved in more wars, and war doesn't become a possibility but almost a certainty. And then as society itself breaks down in America, where we're less fit, we're less moral, the sorts of people who join your military are less fit and less moral because it can only draw from the population, and as such the force itself is degraded. And then you get rid of a bunch of people who refuse to take an untested medical procedure for their body. You get rid of all of those people who have many good values in other ways. They're not willing to just quote unquote trust the science because the New York Times said so, bro. You get rid of all those people, and now what kind of military do you have? So even here in the year 2000, they're talking about difficulties in recruiting and retaining. Why? Well, because it's not a very attractive life. So what are you going to do? You're just going to offer them more money, hopefully that people will just trade it and say, well, I'll get this money. Maybe I'll get killed in Afghanistan, but maybe the money will make up for it. There's just a detachment from reality. Why? Because this is written by people who've never served in the military or don't have any children in the military. If they did, they would know that this sort of statement is detached from reality, as much of this report is. Here's a bar where it says main military mission during the Cold War was to deter Soviet expansionism. But in the 21st century, it should be to secure and expand zones of democratic peace, deter the rise of new great power competitor, defend key regions, exploit the transformation of war. And I want to go back to this again. Why would we want to deter the rise of a new great power competitor? And I know I'm going to run up against the realist school of Professor Mearsheimer here, but I'm just asking this posed in a regular manner. If you believe in the power of competition, just broadly in life, whether that's in sports, whether that's in business, whether even with your family playing a board game, competition should and can bring out both the best and the worst in you. But the idea is competition is not in itself a bad thing, and it shouldn't be run away from. And it shouldn't be, in this case, deterred, meaning it not even allowed to happen. Competition can ask us to look at things differently, ask us to change things within ourselves. And the idea that we're not even going to allow the question to be asked, we're going to deter it. First of all, and I keep saying it over and over, but I'm going to keep repeating it. It's a silly and stupid idea, but it's not even possible. You cannot, as history has shown us, and only the people who are not students of history would deny this, you cannot deter the rise of a great power. All you can do is manage it at best, but you can't stop it permanently. And that's what this entire paper is proposing. In Europe, for example, the overwhelming majority of Army and Air Force units remain at their Cold War bases in Germany or England, while the security problems on the continent have moved to Southeast Europe. The security problems on the continent. We've made them move there. And why are there U.S. military bases in Germany and England decades after the end of World War II? Because Germany and England are very happy to have the U.S. pay to protect them. And in the meantime, they take the money that they would have had to spend on their own military and spend it on making life better for their people. Why would the Germans or the English want the Americans to leave? The Americans, in this particular position, want to project their power. It's a win-win in that way, but it's a lose-lose, actually, for both peoples. And even though the German people might be happy that the government has more money to spend on them, ultimately, they have outsourced all of their foreign policy decisions to the United States. They have no free hand. Nord Stream can get blown up. An investment of the German people can get blown up by the U.S., and they have to spend more money for U.S. LNG, which costs orders of magnitude more than cheap natural gas from Russia, which is your natural neighbor. Why? Because the United States controls German foreign policy. And that's the only price that you have to pay for having U.S. forces garrisoned on your soil. Temporary rotations of forces to the Balkans and elsewhere in Southeast Europe increase the overall burdens of these operations many times. Likewise, the Clinton administration has continued the fiction that the operations of American forces in the Persian Gulf are merely temporary duties. Nearly a decade after the Gulf War, U.S. air, ground, and naval forces continue to protect enduring American interests in the region. In addition to rotating naval forces, the Army maintains what amounts to an armored brigade in Kuwait for 9 months of every year. The Air Force has 2 composite air wings in constant no-fly zone operations over northern and southern Iraq. And despite increasing worries about the rise of China and instability in Southeast Asia, U.S. forces are found almost exclusively in Northeast Asian bases. So they're not looking to find some path to peace. They're looking to prolong and extend the reach. So we've secured Western Europe. So now we have to move to Southeastern Europe and project there. We've secured Northeastern Asia. We need to move to Southeast Asia and force project there. It's just so disheartening to read this. Homeland defense. America must defend its homeland. During the Cold War, nuclear deterrence was the key element in homeland defense. It remains essential, but the new century has brought with it new challenges. While reconfiguring its nuclear force, the United States must also counteract the effects of the proliferation of ballistic missiles and weapons of mass destruction that may soon allow lesser states to deter U.S. military action by threatening U.S. allies in the American homeland itself. So let me decode that. We have to maintain our position as the greatest collector of ballistic missiles and weapons of mass destruction, because if anyone else were to have it, that would force us to have to negotiate instead of simply imposing our will on everybody else, which is what currently happens. and you have the famous exchange with the Athenians and the Melians, the strong do as they wish, the weak suffer what they must. America has been saying this for a very long time, and everyone else has had to take it. That time is coming to an end. Second, the United States must retain sufficient forces able to rapidly deploy and win multiple simultaneous large-scale wars, and also to be able to respond to unanticipated contingencies in regions where it does not maintain forward-based forces. This resembles the two-war standard that has been the basis of U.S. force planning over the past decade. Yet this standard needs to be updated to account for new realities and potential new conflicts. Constabulary duties. The Pentagon must retain forces to preserve the current peace in ways that fall short of conducting major theater campaigns. A decade's experience and the policies of two administrations have shown that such forces must be expanded to meet the needs of the new, long-term NATO mission in the Balkans, an offensive mission, not a defensive mission, the continuing no-fly zone and other missions in Southwest Asia, and other presence missions in vital regions of East Asia. These duties are today's most frequent missions, requiring forces configured for combat, but capable of long-term, independent constabulary operations. In other words, occupying parts of the world, people who probably don't want us there. If the United States were to forego its ability to defeat aggression in more than one theater at a time, our standing as a global power, as the security partner of choice, and security partner of choice, it makes it sound like a hotel, and the leader of the international community would be called into question. Indeed, some allies would undoubtedly read a one-war capability as a signal that the United States, if heavily engaged elsewhere, would no longer be able to defend their interests. Yeah, why don't you defend your interests instead of having the United States defend your interests? This is part of what has weakened so many of these countries. The presence of American forces in critical regions around the world is the visible expression of the extent of America's status as a superpower and as the guarantor of liberty, peace, and stability. I wrote two things in the margin. First of all, who pays for that? And secondly, why is this the opposite of what it really means? When you say the presence of American forces is the visible expression of the extent of America's status as a superpower, as the guarantor of liberty, peace, and stability, it is really just the expression of American imperialism, and that we will tell you what to do. We are the ones who knock, and don't cross us, or we'll make life terrible for you. How is that a good thing? Despite the shifting focus of conflict in Europe, a requirement to station U.S. forces in Northern and Central Europe remains. The region is stable, but a continued American presence helps to assure the major European powers, especially Germany, that the United States retains its long-standing security interest in the continent. And I put 3 exclamation marks next to it. So America is stuck being in Europe for forever, even though America doesn't have a presence in Europe. The Europeans are stuck with training wheels for the rest of their existence. They're never allowed to take care of themselves again. They're little children that have to be taken care of daddy that lives across the water. This is especially important in light of the nascent European moves towards an independent defense identity and policy. How dare they? It is important that NATO not be replaced by the European Union, gasp, leaving the United States without a voice in European security affairs. I wrote, who cares, in the margin. By guaranteeing the security of our current allies and newly democratic nations in East Asia, the United States can help ensure that the rise of China is a peaceful one. Right, like the rise of America, very peaceful. Indeed, in time, American and allied power in the region may provide a spur to the process of democratization inside China itself. Once again, it's not enough that America has its own problems, which hardly speak to how democratic America actually is. But we're going to go and try to change the government in another country. It just shows pride, hubris, an inability to look in the mirror and ask yourself, what is actually important to you? And it's ignoring the problems at home and focusing on the problems abroad. That's a major problem. Track that all the way down to an individual level, in which someone is focused on doing all these other things, but they don't put their own house in order. That's a real problem. As I alluded to earlier, the second part of the document, which I'm getting into now, is looking at specific policy policy recommendations for different branches of the armed forces. I'm going to skim through this, but it reiterates what I'd been talking about earlier, and I'll repeat some of the things I've said. The Army should be restored in active duty strength and structure to meet the requirements of its current missions. Overall active strength should rise to approximately 525,000 soldiers from the current strength of 475,000. Much of this increase should bolster the overdeployed and undermanned units that provide combat support and combat service support, such as military intelligence, military police, and other similar units. I wrote in the margins, how? What happens if you can't increase the strength of your military? What if you can't either recruit or convert enough of your reserve to active duty in order to do this? They're simply making an assertion thinking that this is out there. All we have to do is increase our forces. Okay, how are you going to do that? Especially this was written in 2000, before Afghanistan, before Iraq, before these other disasters America's got itself involved in. They could have perhaps deluded themselves prior to 2000, but post-2000, post-war on terror, post-Guantanamo, how many Americans do they think are really out there who want to go die for Israel? I think that's the question that has to be asked, which, of course, Project for the New American Century, as a major Zionist force, isn't going to ever ask that question. They assume everybody wants to die for Israel. Here's another line. Regimes are difficult to change based upon punishment alone. Have the Israelis learned this lesson in Gaza? If we kill enough people, Hamas will go away. Wrong. But the fact that this is simply an idea that regime change should be a way that governments operate is crazy. It's absolutely crazy. Restore the condition of the institutional Air Force, expanding its personnel strength, rebuilding its core of pilots and experienced maintenance NCOs, expanding support specialties such as intelligence and special police, and reinvigorating its training establishment. Overall, Air Force active personnel strength should be gradually increased by approximately 30,000 to 40,000, and the service should rebuild a structure of 18 to 19 active and 8 reserve wing equivalents. And I wrote in the margins, how? All of these things are simply assertions. You must do this. With what money? For what reason? And it just assumes there's infinite money, because the U.S. has the world's reserve currency, that we'll just always have the money to do this, and that the American people will always back it up. There's no case being made. It's simply asserted. This is how it's supposed to be, and that's why it's going to be this way. Our men and women are separated from their home bases and families for unpredictable and extended periods every year, with a significant negative impact on retention. This doesn't even mention the fact that a lot of these marriages end in divorce. Why? Because of separation, because Americans are away from the homeland, projecting power onto countries where we're not necessarily welcomed and we're certainly not necessarily needed. And what's the price we pay? We pay with the destruction of our own families. As families get destroyed, the nation gets weaker. But we still have to project power overseas. This is being acknowledged right here, that by their families being away, unpredictable and extended periods every year, a significant negative impact on retention. So they're only focused on the fact that, well, some people may not re-enlist. They're not focusing on the fact that that may have cost them their marriage, and that's part of why they didn't re-enlist. Who cares if somebody doesn't re-enlist in the army? I'm much more interested in whether that family survived, because the destruction of the family is the destruction of our society. Society is built upon the family, and if we don't defend the family, our societies are going to be ruined. Doesn't matter how quote-unquote great your society is. If you attack families, if you encourage divorce through policies like this, if you even allow divorce, that's a separate conversation, you're going to have the destruction of your society. You're going to have division in your society. Here they're talking about the Navy. I've talked about the Army and the Air Force so far. Assuming the traditional ship life of about 30 to 35 years, maintaining a 300 ship Navy requires the purchase of about 8 to 10 ships per year. I put 2 exclamation marks in the margin. The slight increase in the shipbuilding rate is achieved by purchasing less expensive auxiliary cargo ships, which typically cost $300 to $400 million, compared to $1 billion for an attack submarine, or Arleigh Burke-class Aegis destroyers, or $6 billion for an aircraft carrier. And obviously, this is in year 2000 numbers. I'm sure it costs much more now. But this sort of casual idea, like, well, we'll just buy a nuclear attack sub, or we'll just build an aircraft carrier. These are choices that a society makes. And if the choice that you make as a society is that we'd rather have a nuclear submarine than high-speed rail, or I'd rather have an aircraft carrier than passable roads in our country, than bridges that don't collapse. We're watching bridges collapse. We're watching tunnels collapse in America now. It's because we've made these choices. We've opted for these jets that cost millions of dollars, which we fly over every time there's a sports game and we cheer. These weapons of mass destruction that are costing us our country. That's effectively what they cost. It's a cool story, bro, that you've got nice jets flying over your football game or your NASCAR race. But what's happening to your country as a result of the life is about choices, and it's the same for a country as well as it is for a person. So the choices we make are to have cool toys that fly over our sporting events, which distract us from real life and our real purpose. And we think that we're still the most awesome, greatest thing ever. That's all part of the delusion. As the American security perimeter in Europe is removed eastward, I just stopped right there and I said, why? Why would we want to move the American security perimeter in Europe eastward? Oh, you mean towards Ukraine? You mean towards the border with Russia? I'm sure that won't be a problem. As stressed several times above, the United States should seek to establish or re-establish a more robust naval presence in Southeast Asia, marked by a long-term, semi-permanent home port in the region, perhaps in the Philippines, Australia, or both. Yeah, that really worked out for us well the last time in the Philippines. I'm not going to get into it here, but why don't you check it out by doing some research yourself? Over the next decade, this presence should become roughly equivalent to the naval forces stationed in Japan. 17 ships based around the Kitty Hawk Carrier Battle Group and the Belleau-Wood Marine Amphibious Ready Group. Optimally, these forward deployed forces, both in Japan and ultimately in Southeast Asia, should be increased with additional surface combatants. And I wrote, why? This is inviting danger. This is inviting problems. And I'm thinking of a line from The Hunt for Red October. If this is a film that I've watched many times, there's parts of it I can quote by heart, but there is an exchange between Jeffrey Pelt and the Russian ambassador, and I'm going to read it to you now, and I'll try to do the inflection of the actor. I don't remember the actor's name, but he does a fantastic job. He says, "Mr. Ambassador, you have nearly 100 naval vessels operating in the North Atlantic right now. Your aircraft has dropped enough sonar buoys so that a man can walk from Greenland to Iceland to Scotland without getting his feet wet. Now, shall we dispense with the bull?" And he was pushing back on the fact that the Russians were saying, oh, we don't know what's going on. We're doing a naval exercise. And he follows up with, it would be well for your government to consider that having your ships and ours, your aircraft and ours, in such proximity is inherently dangerous. Wars have begun that way, Mr. Ambassador. And that's what's going on here. If you want to position a carrier battle group and an amphibious ready group in the Philippines or Northern Australia, why is that? If you're not going to move the group that you have in Japan, you're encircling China. And how well does that work out? They're delusional enough to think that a country of more than 1 billion people is simply going to look and say, oh, we're so intimidated by the US, I'm sure we could never take them on. Aircraft carriers are obsolete. There are weapons that have been developed now that can sink all the aircraft carriers that the United States has, and America could do nothing about it other than retaliate with a nuclear strike. And we still are thinking in these outdated terms. We'll just surround China and then they won't do anything about it. No, China will do something about it at some point. That's the nice thing about being a 5,000-year-old civilization. You don't think about things in short term the way that Americans do. An older power can think about things more considerately, especially with sort of Confucian cultural baggage, or if you don't want to say baggage, equipment, operating system that the Chinese have. They're able to look at this more concretely. I'm not trying to be an apologist for communism. China has its own problems. I am saying that the idea that you need to spend your time, your money, your people in regime changing other countries is a failed strategy. It has been shown to fail for a century. America has been involved in deploying its forces, as Smedley Butler said, to be gangsters for capitalism. I'm not interested in being part of that. And that's part of why I didn't continue on in the Marines. And that's probably a discussion for another time. Here they tell on themselves, had the Chinese actually targeted missiles at Taiwan, it is doubtful that the Aegis air defense systems aboard the cruisers and destroyers in the battle groups could have provided an effective defense. Punitive strikes against Chinese forces by carrier aircraft or cruise missile strikes might have been a second option, but a problematic one. So they're even admitting here in the year 2000, even if we were to do something, it wouldn't necessarily be helpful. And are we really going to have another war in Asia? How many times does America have to learn this lesson? In Korea, in Japan, in Vietnam, that this doesn't lead anywhere good. In general, to maintain American military preeminence that is consistent with the requirements of a strategy of American global leadership, tomorrow's U.S. Armed Forces must meet 3 new missions. Global missile defenses. A network against limited strikes capable of protecting the United States, its allies, and forward deployed forces must be constructed. This must be a layered system of land, sea, air, and space-based components. As I said earlier, there's nothing wrong with defending your homeland, and if you want to put together a complex network of missile defense in order to do that, great. At the same time as you're doing that, you should be working to create an enduring peace with the people who you are worried that might actually strike you, such that you reduce the possibility of a strike happening. It does no good to create a defense, because if the defense works, it's still going to cost you a lot of money to do. If the defense only partially works, you're going to have a lot of destruction. That's not really the goal that you want. The goal that you want is to not have the strikes in the first place. And it's far likelier that if your counterparty has as much to lose as you do, through what we saw in the Cold War, mutually assured destruction, that was part of how peace was preserved. We saw that both parties would be dramatically hurt by the escalation of hostilities, and so that was what, in many ways, preserved the peace. That's not what they're going for here. They're looking to escalate. Peace through escalation, peace through strength. And that's only looking at it one way. And as I say, it's important for you to defend your homeland. 100% I support that idea. But just as importantly should be the diplomatic side and working for peace and looking for long-term cooperation such that people don't want to fight you. Yes, there's good in the world. Yes, there's evil in the world. But it's a lot harder for that evil, quote unquote, to come into existence and to form an attack on your nation if you spent so much time fostering goodwill and peace. That's just how it works. That's what history has taught us. Control of space and cyberspace. Much as control of the high seas and the protection of international commerce defined global powers in the past, so will control of the new international commons be a key to world power in the future. An America incapable of protecting its interests or that of its allies in space or the infosphere will find it difficult to exert global political leadership. Once again, I think it is important for you to protect your digital assets, your digital infrastructure for the homeland. But the idea that you must then project that power out onto the whole world is not supportable. It's also not sustainable. Pursuing a 2-stage strategy for transforming conventional forces, and then they go on and on here about some of the medical things that they talked about. And there's a couple things that they note here which I think have come to fruition. As long as wars and other military operations derive their logic from political purposes, land power will remain the truly decisive form of military power. Indeed, it is ironic that as post-Cold War military operations have become more sophisticated and more reliant on air power and long-range strikes, they have become less politically decisive. Very true. And I think that is a point that's well taken, that no matter what the future holds as far as drones and clones and other things, land power is still going to be important. And you can't just bomb people into submission, as the Israelis refuse to learn about the Palestinians. While the exact scope and nature of such change is a matter for experimentation, Army studies already suggest that it will be dramatic. Consider just the potential changes that might affect the infantrymen. Future soldiers may operate in encapsulated, climate-controlled, powered fighting suits, laced with sensors, and boasting chameleon-like active camouflage. Skin patch pharmaceuticals help regulate fears, focus concentration, and enhance endurance and strength. This is all related. Some of this was anticipated by Robert Heinlein in his novel, Starship Troopers, only loosely related to the movie. Focus on the novel here. These idea of these future soldiers, all of the features they're talking about, Heinlein talked about in the book. A display mounted on a soldier's helmet permits a comprehensive view of the battlefield, in effect, to look around corners and over hills, and allows the soldier to access the entire combat information and intelligence system while filtering incoming data to prevent overload, probably provided by drones. Individual weapons are more lethal, and a soldier's ability to call for highly precise and reliable indirect fires, not only from Army systems but those of other services, allows each individual to have great influence over huge spaces. Under the Land Warrior program, some Army experts envision a squad of 7 soldiers able to dominate an area the size of the Gettysburg battlefield, where in 1863 some 165,000 men fought. And if you've ever been to Gettysburg, it is vast. There are some battlefields in the war between the states in which there are parts that you can see most of the battlefield. For example, at Sharpsburg, you're able to see most of the battlefield, and then you can see where it comes down into a ravine. But at Gettysburg, you have to drive to different parts of the battlefield because it's so vast. The idea that 7 soldiers would be able to dominate a space that large is, in many ways, mind-blowing, but understandable given the rise in technology. And I think that, at least in this particular sphere, this document provides something worthwhile looking at. If the United States withdrew forces from the Balkans, for example, it is unlikely that the rest of NATO would be able to long pick up the slack. Conversely, such a withdrawal would provoke a political crisis within NATO that would certainly result in the end of American leadership within NATO. It might well spell the end of the alliance. I wrote wonderful in the margins. As admitted above, calculating the exact price of armed forces capable of maintaining American military preeminence today and extending it into the future, and in quotation, in parentheses, indefinitely, requires more detailed analysis than this broad study can provide. We have advocated a force posture and service structure that diverges significantly both from current plans and alternatives advanced in other studies. We believe it is necessary to increase the personnel strength of U.S. forces. Many of the missions associated with patrolling the expanding American security perimeter are manpower intensive, and planning for major theater wars must include the ability for politically decisive campaigns, including extended post-combat stability operations. Also, this expanding perimeter, which is going to take over the whole world at some point, they're not going to have any say in it because we're in charge. Also, this expanding perimeter argues strongly for new overseas bases. Wow, the 700 and nearly 800 bases that are published, plus the numerous CIA black sites which are not published, that's not enough. We need to have more. More new overseas bases and forward operating locations to facilitate American political and military operations around the world. Only such a force posture, service structure, and level of defense spending will provide America and its leaders with a variety of forces to meet the strategic demands of the world's sole superpower. Keeping the American peace, and I put American peace in quotes, requires the U.S. military to undertake a broad array of missions today and rise to very different challenges tomorrow. But there can be no retreat from these missions without compromising American leadership and the benevolent order it secures. This is the choice we face. It is not a choice between preeminence today and preeminence tomorrow. Global leadership is not something exercised at our leisure when the mood strikes us or when our core national security interests are directly threatened. Then it is already too late. Rather, it is a choice whether or not to maintain American military preeminence, to secure American geopolitical leadership, and to preserve the American peace. For people who've read even the littlest bit of history, for people who've lived in any other parts of the world, that conclusion to this document should read like the rest of the document, which is hell. It's hell to read a document like this. But to people in the Trump administration, this probably doesn't go far enough. It doesn't America first hard enough. And that's the great tragedy, is here in September of 2000, and here we are in May of 2025. Nothing's changed. The people in charge of the United States are still making sure that we're involved in wars, oppressing the entire world, making it less stable, making it less prosperous, and making everybody's decisions subject to our whims. That is not a winning strategy for the United States. Ironically, it's not at all an America first strategy. It makes the world less stable, which makes things less likely to be successful for the United States. But the people who are in charge of America, as President Putin says, the men in the dark blue suits who work for various forces, including the military industrial complex, need things to continue as is. And that's why in America things don't really change, whether they're Republican or Democrat. They have the same policies on almost everything. They just like to get people involved in a big red versus blue fight every 2 or 4 years, but nothing really changes. I'm sorry to end on that note, but that's the reality. And I managed to keep my voice down for most of this review, which I'm proud of myself for doing. If you'd like to get a copy of this, I'll put a link to it in the description. It's widely available. If you'd like to support this channel, hit like, subscribe, share this with people who might be interested in these issues. It's a free way for you to support this channel. It's a way for you to make sure that the channel grows. If you'd like to thank me for this political review, this particular review, it was political as well. If you'd like to thank me for this particular review, there's Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal links. If you'd like to support this this work on an ongoing basis, get early access to reviews like this one, as well as member-exclusive videos, consider Patreon or YouTube membership. If you'd like to sponsor a future video, I have my Amazon wishlist linked below. You can click through there and find books that you might be interested in sponsoring. If you send that to me, I will then review the book in a timely manner. You might see books on Palestine, which are not for this channel. That's for my Palestine Bookshelf channel. If you're at all interested in the Palestine issue, maybe navigate over there or nominate a book from the wish list for there, and you'll see it pop up on the Palestine Bookshelf channel. As always, until next time, enjoy your reading.